into the policy roundtable. Okay, everybody else take a deep breath except for me, okay, for a second, because we're not going to kind of take 5 minutes, and usually kind of we have some break here, but because of the way we structured this agenda, we're going to just move right into it. And we're just a few minutes late, so I want to kind of jump right in. I want to introduce some new members first. Can we go to the next slide, and just at least I will read their names, and then we can go back to the kind of, again, the screenshots of everybody. But for this policy roundtable, we are fortunate to have with us still the clinical experts whom you've all already met, Dr. Burns and Dr. Kapitsinu. And we have our patient representatives, Troy Zimmerman, who's from the National Kidney Foundation, and we have Mr. Gee from iAdvocate. With us, we also have now, we've got representatives from 2 of the drug makers. We've got Carrie Cooper, who's the Vice President for U.S. Renal Medical Affairs from AstraZeneca. And we have, there it is, we have Yola Golick, who's Executive Director of U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Amgen. All right, so, and in addition, we have 2 representatives of payers. We have Rosalie Patel, who's a Principal Pharmacist in Formulary Strategy and Management at Blue Shield of California. And we have Leslie Fish, who has been a long time kind of pharmacy and therapeutics manager and benefits and formulary design kind of expert in managed care, and is now Vice President of Clinical Pharmacy at IPD Analytics. So you can see their conflicts of interest there. Obviously, they all represent a perspective. And let's now go to the visual aspects so we can start to talk about how we can translate some of this evidence and uncertainty into coverage, into pricing, and into clinical practice. So can we take down the slides? Okay, and CTAF, again, a lot of this conversation will focus on members of the roundtable. If you want, you can turn off your cameras and then you can come back in if you have a question. Please feel free to use your raise hand function for that, if you will. That'll make it easier for me to try to catch you. But let me just start by welcoming the folks on the roundtable again. So that was, as you can tell, there are a lot of questions, and there always are. You know, with new treatments, there are always questions about things that we don't know yet, and yet, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the there's a sense of celebration that we may have a new treatment option. Obviously, if I'm thinking about roxadustat, it's not been FDA approved yet, but we're forecasting that possibility. So I have a series of questions, again, to try to get us through what I think are going to be some really important questions, because, again, we'd love to wait a year or two probably to set the price, because we could consider that price in the context of better data. We're not going to do that. If this drug becomes approved, there will be a price. Doctors and patients will start to use it. We'll learn more, but it's worth, I think, exploring how we're going to navigate those early months and maybe years, even at this point. So I want to start with one question, first off, actually, which is there a way, let's assume that roxadustat is approved, and I'm kind of going to make that as a supposition for a lot of this conversation. How would that be introduced into the healthcare system in the way that could do the best job possible of addressing disparities in the healthcare system and in our society? Is there a way that we need to think about its introduction, either through patient education, through clinician education, through other mechanisms? Is there something about what we can do as a healthcare system to try to ensure that this new innovation does the best possible job at addressing disparities? Troy or Patrick, not sure if you've thought that concretely about it yet, because roxadustat has not been approved. But can you imagine that future, and do you have any thoughts, maybe even based on what you've seen on prior innovations and how they were or were not well introduced? What can we do to do a better job with it this time around?
This is Patrick. In 2018 and 2019, there was a PCORI study that involved the Medical Technology and Practice Pattern Institute on anemia with dialysis patients. What was interesting at the conclusion of the study, the participants were predominantly African Americans. The bulk of them that came to the meeting were based in Washington, D.C. I want to say about 85% were based in Washington, D.C. 95% of the people that participated in that study had no clue what the word anemia meant. None. Even those that were doing in-center hemodialysis, as well as those that are doing home dialysis. So I think, for one, we need to do a better job with pre-educational resources on anemia, as well as to do maybe in-service or whatever kind of follow-up with clinicians on how to correctly educate the population on this. Because a lot of the questions that you asked, that you were voting on, it's hard to answer because, one, the most impacted communities weren't of large population in the clinical trials. So you have to try to figure out strategies on how to include the most underserved and undervalued communities to participate in clinical trials. That's going to take trying to develop more transparency and trust in African American communities. Even now, with a broken healthcare system, you know, where even right now, as we're living in COVID, with a lot of clinics closing down, and you know, people living in food deserts, not able to even eat nutritionally enough to kind of deal with anemia, along with, you know, treatment therapies, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So if you wanted to take an approach, it's going to take a boots on the ground strategy. A lot of people in the community will listen to patient advocates or patient partners over clinicians, or a partnership with patient advocates as well as clinicians, talking directly to the community, especially those that are living with anemia and trying to manage their anemia. Because if they can see somebody that's going through it, they can relate to the experience. I would also say to include local clinics, church healthcare systems, and trying to disseminate this information into the community, because now, especially during COVID, churches have become very prominent in disseminating health-related information. So when you can look at how to strategically break down some of these barriers, I believe not only will you get acceptance of medications, but it also help care partners and caregivers to better help those that they're caring for to understand the effectiveness of this medication, so that they'll be willing to accept this.
Thank you. Thank you. Troy, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I believe it would be most effective if it was a combined effort from the clinicians and the patient organizations. And I certainly feel that, particularly in the case of the patient organizations, it'd be beneficial to have representatives from those ethnic and racial minorities conveying the message, since that was part of the question. Certainly, I think another advantage of the patient organizations is the clinicians probably provide a lot of information in any given visit with their patients, and I'm sure it can be very overwhelming. I mean, I can tell you sometimes I come out of the doctor's office and I haven't remembered every single thing in detail. And I think in both those regards, it needs to be in simple language. We know the education level of a lot of individuals, particularly on dialysis, but probably with CKD as well. And it has to the message has to be something that they can clearly understand and retain.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit provocative, which is kind of my job here, by the way. By the end of each policy roundtable, most participants have at least had one question that they're not happy with that I've asked them. So get in line. It'll be your turn soon enough. But the CTAF, that panel of professors of medicine, of patient advocates and others, voted 15-0 that the evidence wasn't adequate to say that this drug was better than a placebo. So is the message, and now I'm kind of asking you to play both sides. So I'm assuming that FDA will approve it. Is there a risk that we might over educate or oversell this drug when it's a very subtle question yet about for which patients it will offer certain benefits and how it should be managed? Now, I'm a previous clinician, so I know the usual line here, which is that we'll trust the doctors to help manage that. And they'll help educate patients, and it should be shared decision-making. But I did want to ask, Jeff or Penelope, do you guys have any thoughts on how you've seen other introductions? And for this patient population, which is already overwhelmed probably trying to keep track of the pills and the different things that they've got to do with their condition, because it affects everything in their systems, in their body and their health. I mean, how do you view this as, from your perspective, what should we do when this drug, let's assume it gets approved with the evidence we were able to review today?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail, and I'd like to hear from Penelope as well. I think you hit the nail on the head with the use of the term shared decision-making. I think this is going to require, and I'll look at two different populations, or I'll think about two different populations here. The CKD patient not on dialysis, I think it's going to require a conversation between the patient, family, and the physician about the pros and cons. And I would include as a con the unknowns. The prolyl hydroxylase inhibitors have not been tested in huge numbers of patients over long periods of time compared to ESAs, which, as we heard, have been tested have been used for many, many years in many, many patients. And I think patients need to understand that there is a degree of uncertainty about long-term risks and benefits. But I think it certainly merits a conversation about, this is an injection versus a pill, and, there's going to be cost factors for individuals depending upon their insurance and those sorts of things. In the dialysis unit, I suspect the conversation is going to be very different, because what happens in the dialysis unit is usually directed by the dialysis facility. If you think now about dialysis facilities, patients don't have a choice as to which ESA they get. They get either darbepoetin or epoetin, or actually now it's probably close to half get an ESA that hasn't even been looked at in any of the clinical trials with prolyl hydroxylase inhibitors, which is methoxypolyethylene glycol epoetin beta. And it's pretty close to half of dialysis patients now get that as their ESA. So in the dialysis unit, it may be this is what we have available. Now, whether dialysis facilities will give patients a choice of a prolyl hydroxylase inhibitor or an ESA, I think it remains to be seen. As Patrick mentioned, at dialysis facilities, most individuals get intravenous injections of ESAs on some time basis. So it's not really, they don't have to deal with the issues of getting a subcutaneous injection. So I think that remains to be seen. The decisions that dialysis facilities will make in this regard are not based only on price, but on profit. So that's going to enter into the decision-making that they undergo in terms of what drugs are made available. Penelope, do you have anything to add?
I agree totally that there has to be a discussion with patients who have CKD. And in regards to the dialysis population, we have definitely a different, situation. Now, specifically, what I want to highlight for the CKD patients, the patients who are not on dialysis, is that the landscape is rapidly changing, in this aspect. there are new medications. We know, in the nephrology field, we are very excited with the SGLT2 inhibitors, who basically change the progression of kidney disease, the cardiovascular events, even the hemoglobin among these patients. And it will be important to study ESAs and or PHT inhibitors with these new evolutions. Plus the fact that there is going to be a huge need in the CKD clinics to integrate this intervention, meaning the SGLT2 inhibitors, and then along with that, potentially prolyl hydroxylase inhibitors. So it's going to be pretty challenging in this evolving field that there are new treatments to have this addition. And the clinicians will need to be educated about, new protocols for follow-up. So with the injections, at least we have the control. The patient will come to the facility, we will check their hemoglobin. And if they are too high, we know that we need to halt, the ESA. With the prolyl hydroxylase inhibitors, to some degree, they are in control. So the clinics have to have effective protocols that prevent patients from overshooting their hemoglobins and so forth. So there's going to be complexity in terms of establishing the treatment, especially in the CKD field, but also integrating with the new advances, in this patient population.
So you seemed, honestly, you seemed quite happy at the complexity of all these new treatments coming in. You were smiling. I can see the that's the celebration side. And I started to think again about, where we started in a sense with how do we introduce these in a way that doesn't at least worsen disparities and might help them.
Yeah.
But this is going to require a Herculean effort on the part of educators, on families, and on clinicians to kind of weave all these different treatment options into a way that the patients can make sense of. I honestly don't envy you that much, because I think it's, in some ways, it's going to be challenging. But I understand the excitement of having these options. Please go ahead.
Actually from improving outcomes. So the outcomes of the population with the new treatments are improving, and we just have to catch up with this in terms of implementation. So.
Right. The last thing I wanted to ask the clinical experts, at least for now, is we heard a bit about the exclusion criteria in the trials, and I will come back to that when we're talking about what insurance companies will do. But from a clinical perspective, is there going to be a fairly small number of patients that you're going to feel roxadustat is perfect for, and you're going to worry about a lot of patients who have the cardiovascular issues and everything else? Sometimes both manufacturers and health plans will ask, are the clinical experts going to be banging on our doors for this? Or is it going to be a really slow kind of trickle of uptake based on clinical concerns? And we'll talk about the payment issues too, but where do you see the role in therapy and how rapidly the uptake will be? How broad will the patients be that clinicians are going to call that health plan and say, no, really, they need roxadustat?
Again, I can go first. I think that some of that's going to depend upon style. I personally tend to be very conservative when it comes to introducing new therapies into my own practice. So in the office practice of nephrology, the CKD patients, I think if I have patients who are doing well on infrequent dosing of an ESA, I mostly use darbepoetin. If their hemoglobin is where I want them to be, I'll give them an option of staying on that or making an adjustment, starting a new medication. I think in the dialysis unit, it's going to, again, be a different discussion. I think the dialysis facilities will make some decisions on behalf of their patients, rightly or wrongly, about what therapies, I guess we can't use the term ESAs only anymore, whether they will make wholesale shifts to roxadustat or another oral prolyl hydroxylase inhibitor over time and eliminate injectable ESAs entirely, or whether they use a mix of ESAs and oral agents, I think is a decision that they're going to end up making at some point in time. Probably not in the immediate near future, but eventually they will do that. And I assume, given the history, largely based upon the financial implications for the dialysis facility. In my own personal style, again, is if a patient's doing well, I don't feel a compulsion to change to a new therapy, particularly since we know what the risk benefit profile is of ESAs to a large extent.
So the cardiac effects, in a sense, does that rule out a large number of patients, though, that you just won't even consider Roxa for a while?
I think again, just personally, I think concern about long-term side effects and people have talked about pulmonary hypertension, about cardiovascular implications, about diabetic retinopathy, even risk of malignancy, and which is something that we saw with ESAs in terms of cancer and stroke. I personally tend to be conservative, and unless there's a real strong indication for switching, then I probably would do so slowly. The one group of patients where I might move quicker would be those who are relatively hyporesponsive to an ESA and or are having trouble mobilizing iron for erythropoiesis, and that group may be one that it might make sense to try these medications sooner, perhaps.
Okay. Penelope, let you answer that too, if you wish. And let me just throw one extra little question on top, which is the patient who comes in and says, I heard on TV about this new drug that's a pill that I don't have to have an injection. Can I switch to that one? How often do you think you're going to face that? And how much of a factor do you think that should play in the decision about which drug to take?
Penelope, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, yeah. So I won't jump on, emphasizing the fact that now we are talking about a pill versus an injection. I won't consider this as a stroke advantage, but of course, this is it requires a discussion with the patient, because this is my opinion. The patient is, the person who receives the medication in that case. The problem with a pill is that the frequency, is, daily or, as opposed to once per week or once every 2 weeks, for ESAs. So it really requires a discussion with the patient, and, the patient needs to be aware that they still need to have, the blood counts checked and, so forth. So I would be shy and won't jump easily on, starting new treatments. And I, would have to individualize the treatment and not overemphasize the convenience of the oral route versus the injection.
Can I make one additional comment just in terms of talking about this with patients? And I know that Carrie wants to make a comment. I think one other thing that patients will need to consider is that if they're stable on an ESA and they're getting their hemoglobins checked once a month or even less often, when they make a switch to a new agent, all of that changes. And now there's going to have to be more frequent dose adjustments, more frequent hemoglobin monitoring, at least for some period of time, probably not an extended period of time, but just something else for individuals to consider.
Sure. Carrie, if you did want to jump in, I was going to ask you a somewhat, again, kind of, I was going to frame it in a provocative way, which was, if the evidence of the comparative effectiveness of roxadustat versus ESAs is something that's still going to be determined over a much longer time frame, and that right now people feel like they can't distinguish it, isn't the marketing division of your company right now trying to come up with a way to really encourage patients to view the oral option as the reason to switch? Because it's hard for you to it's hard for you to market it as a superior clinical agent. It's going to be other aspects of the care that you're going to want to emphasize. And I'm not saying that's inappropriate. I'm just saying, is that not going to be the likely kind of line that you take as we see it coming out?
Thanks for that, and thanks for the opportunity to comment. Before I answer that question, I just wanted to come back to the subgroup stuff, because I think that was important. Our trials, like other cardiovascular outcome trials, exclude patients that have had recent cardiovascular events, stroke, MI, et cetera. Background history of cardiovascular disease was not an exclusion. And as was pointed out by one of the previous panel members, of course, these are common comorbidities in the population. So I just wanted to be clear that only patients with recent events or class 3 or 4 heart failure were excluded from the trials. In response to your question, I guess you asked me a question, but you based it on me assuming that I agree with the conclusions of the panel about the evidence. So I think one thing is kind of separating the discussion about cardiovascular safety, which is a very important topic, and I think has been the lion's share of the discussion I've heard, versus the actual discussion about the effectiveness of these drugs in terms of what they're meant to do. The primary reason that these therapies are prescribed is actually to increase hemoglobin and, more importantly, to prevent transfusion. And I think we've touched on the importance of transfusion, but we think that is a critical aspect of our therapy. And I think our evidence overall will support that, whether it's in the NDD population, where the standard of care has been pointed out as placebo for most patients, with only 15% of patients being on an ESA at the time they start dialysis, versus the existing dialysis population, that the overall, the statement has been made that there's no evidence of efficacy compared to a placebo, which I think that question wasn't asked correctly. If the answer was, is there evidence of differences in cardiovascular outcomes, that's one question. But to me, it's incontrovertible that roxadustat compared to placebo clearly raises hemoglobin and decreases transfusion. And as was pointed out by these subject matter experts, also does so whether patients are iron replete, and seems to decrease the need for IV iron. So I think there's still I'm not going to speak about marketing. I'm a nephrologist as well, I should point out, and have been treating patients with anemia for 37 years. So the efficacy part, I think, is a very important part of the differentiation that hasn't gotten maybe as much play here as it should. The other area is, as long as I have the floor for one more minute.
For one more, right, short time, please, go ahead.
Go ahead, is the incident population, because to me, as has been pointed out, it is a subset analysis. Clearly, the incident studies are subset analysis of the overall dialysis population. However, we know all patients are incident at some point. So, and importantly, the morbidity and mortality of incident patients is extremely high. I think one important differential in looking at the data is that in our prevalence studies, if you have a patient that's been on an ESA for 6 years, just on average, that's about the vintage in our studies, those patients have a survival bias because they've been on dialysis and lived through the incident period. And I think the differences in MACE and MACE Plus that were emphasized, we believe that that's our closest head-to-head comparison versus ESAs in a population that is mostly or close to being treatment naive. So agreed, they're not standalone studies, and it is a subset analysis. That is a limitation, but I do think that data is impactful. Getting back to your question.
Let me move. Right. Yeah, no, I'm actually going to take you off the hook for that last question, if that's where you were headed. I actually I'm sensitive to my own poor management of time, because I know a lot of people want to start talking about coverage and payments as well as pricing. So how about if I come back to you on pricing, another topic you'll probably not want to talk about, but we'll get there. So let's shift up to the payers, and let's talk a little bit about some what ifs here. So Leslie, maybe. Leslie, if this drug is approved for the dialysis independent population, so not on Medicare, how do you think private payers are going to come at this? They already cover ESAs for patients who are not on dialysis. Do you think they will try to manage this? Will they view this as a either or approach to managing hemoglobin, such that they could strongly compete the two or tier them in some way, or will they kind of not try to manage this space? How do you think they're philosophically going to come to roxadustat in the dialysis independent population?
So can you hear me?
We can.
Great. That's a great question. And Steve, I'm glad that you actually started it at segmenting, because payers will definitely segment the populations. Commercial, Medicare, and each one then gets segmented out into the dialysis dependent or dialysis independent. So for the dialysis independent, they most likely will be looking at prior authorization to label. And yes, we do think that payers will be managing these. You know, one of the things that we do get a lot of questions from, and for those of you who don't know IPD, we actually we have as our subscribers, many, almost all of the payers, the large payers, small payers, regional, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. So we spend a lot of time talking to our subscribers about this. And Steve, directly to your point, is we are getting a lot of questions. And the reason being, one is that the numbers of patients who could potentially be on these products is far higher than the numbers of patients right now who are not on dialysis, but on ESAs. So number one, the sheer numbers that you could eventually see, and I know that Dr. Burns and Penelope have suggested that they'd be very conservative. Number two, we hear Dr. Cooper also talking about the incident patients, and in order to make sure that an appropriate patient is on it, and that you need to really identify them beforehand. And so these are some of the reasons that a payer would want to look and make sure that they understand who the patient is and is getting the right product at the right time. So the answer to the question, very long, was yes, they will be.
Now, so imagine, would they then lump them together and say one ESA is tier 1, roxadustat is tier 2, and another ESA is tier 3? Will they consider them that, not interchangeable, that's a dangerous word, but will they really consider them that clinically fungible?
So you're going into two different things. What I was actually talking to, and I'll answer your question definitely. The first part was more that will they manage it? That was yes. Second, though, you're asking more about tiering at this point, and it really is going to depend on costing. So you're saying what levels will they put them in? Will they put them in the same levels? Nobody has actually talked about this yet. I'm just going to sort of throw it out there right now, also too, but you do have a biosimilar in addition to the Procrit, Epigen, Aranesp, all the other products that we talked about, the long-acting, short-acting. We also do have biosimilar product out there. So cost becomes a little bit different. Could they be tiered differently depending? Yes, they could.
So before I go to Rosalie, let me quickly flip back to the patient representatives. You are probably familiar with this kind of conversation where if we can get a lower price, there'll be a better tier that will use kind of patient out of pocket to a certain extent to help steer patients one way or the other. Some people feel that that's in direct conflict with the idea of choice and shared decision making, trying to use patient out of pocket to kind of steer them to the lower priced agent, if you will, through that's been arrived at through negotiation. Do you think patients will feel really strongly that they should have access to roxadustat? And do you think that out of pocket payments is a fair way to steer patients towards a higher value option? Troy, maybe I can ask you that because it's a very policy related question.
I think for the patients who want choice, they're not going to be satisfied with the pricing issues and the tiering and a fail first or anything like that. So I think for those who want that choice, they're going to be frustrated if they know that it's available, but it's not available to them, if that answers your question.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, let me also just scale this up because the world doesn't always work in the way that we hope it will. But the free market would suggest that health plans, many of them might not want to be viewed as the easiest health plan on which to get your choice of an anemia drug if that means that they attract a lot of CKD patients who are very expensive otherwise. So I could imagine that health plans are going to have a financial incentive to some extent to try to look tough. and to try to basically either use step therapy or tiering to try to manage this space fairly aggressively. I could be wrong because we're still obviously months perhaps before roxadustat is approved if it is, but I'm just curious if, do you think that because again, we're trying to gauge a little bit about whether the patient demand for this drug is such that they will feel like they're being really ill-served if they have to use an ESA instead, for instance.
I don't think most patients would look at the availability of one therapy, one drug when they're making their choice, if they have a choice of insurance plans. At the same time, it's quite possible that although a patient would want choice, if they feel like they're getting the best available care and the progression of their disease is being appropriately addressed, as Dr. Burns was saying earlier, then they might want the choice, but if they don't have the choice, I don't know that they would necessarily be up in arms about it. I certainly don't. I would be surprised if a patient is going to dig down and compare insurers for to determine the access of one drug, one therapy, or a handful of drugs when they probably take dozens of drugs a week, if not a day.
Okay. Now, my apologies because I'm going to go kind of in a whiplash fashion around the horn a bit, but I want to make sure you all have a chance to make a statement. And I do want to address one issue that almost always comes up in a situation like this, which is, should the insurance coverage criteria mirror the clinical trial eligibility criteria? Let's say the FDA approves it in a broader way with more open-ended language. An insurer might want to look at the clinical eligibility criteria in order to write the prior auth form that doctors will have to fill out. I'm sure Dr. Burns and Dr. Kapitsin are completely familiar with that kind of approach. So I want to kind of bounce between you guys and the payers, and maybe Rosalie, I'll pick on you this time and kind of say, so let's walk through what we could imagine at least a health plan considering doing with its coverage. And do we think this makes sense? It's crazy. They should not try to do that. If they do that, they need to think about A, B, or C. Let's see how far we can get through what kind of a mock coverage policy might look like. So I'm looking at a document that I have that you don't, but I just had it cooked up quickly, which is, it's the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the studies of roxadustat in the dialysis independent population. So first, diagnosis of CKD stages 3 to 5 with an eGFR less than 60. That good to go as a first tick the box, or is that too narrow for the patients that you think should be considered for this drug? We ask the clinical experts first. Is that all right?
Sure. I mean, CKD stage 3 to 5 with a GFR less than 60 sounds pretty reasonable way to start.
Okay, mean hemoglobin less than 10 to 10.5. That's pretty standard from the ESA language. Right. Okay, we've got serum folate levels and other things. I'm going to pass that by. Body weight, I think we can manage. Okay, so then there are a bunch of exclusion criteria that, again, a health plan might consider including. Any chronic inflammatory condition such as lupus, RA, UC, means that you're out. You weren't eligible for the trial at least. Should we exclude patients from considering roxadustat if they have a chronic inflammatory condition? I
won't, because in fact, these are patients who may not be responsive, to EPO. I don't know what, Jeff thinks about it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in clinical practice, that may actually be a group of patients that one might go to earlier rather than later.
Okay, there's an interesting pivot then between the eligibility criteria and interesting. If we had another hour, I'd be interested in knowing why the company chose to exclude patients with those conditions as part of their trial. They think through these things, so I'm sure there's a reason. We talked about the heart failure classes 3 or 4. They were excluded from the trial. A health plan might include that as an exclusion criterion. You think that's reasonable?
They might. I'm not sure clinically I would be inclined to do that, but I think that's certainly, I could see a health plan wanting to eliminate that group in part because it's a large group of patients.
Okay, I'm going to let them respond to that piece, but I will I will definitely, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, so I appreciate it. And no one's going to say that Dr. Jeffrey Burns suggests that insurance does or does not cover this. Don't worry.
You promise?
No, I know, but we have your home address and it'll be part of the report. So just so you know. No, I'm gonna, and I'll let Rosalie respond to the whole kit and caboodle in a second. Only two more. One is just a laundry list of things like within the last 12 weeks, they couldn't have had an MI, unstable angina, seizure, stroke, TIA, that kind of thing. And I assume that from what I've heard before, that would be a no-go zone for clinicians as well with ESAs or these, or would you think that maybe Roxa is the only treatment I could use there, because I know ESAs are bad for those patients? What would you think?
I personally, I hope that clinicians will wait, and in part because treating anemia as we're discussing it is not an emergency, and it can usually wait a little while. So I would hope that given the concerns about these drugs and some of all of the therapies in certain clinical circumstances, that people would wait and use that as an exclusion, at least for that period of time.
Okay. Last one is, and I don't know why this is here, honestly, it's about untreated proliferative diabetic retinopathy, diabetic macular edema. You guys are shaking your heads. There's a reason for this: macular degeneration or retinal vein occlusion. What's up with those exclusions? Are those things that should be on the list for an insurer too, or not?
Yeah, there has been some concern all along, actually, and I've not personally seen much information about this, maybe because these individuals have been excluded from clinical trials, that the prolyl hydroxylase inhibitors may in fact exacerbate at least diabetic retinopathy, if not some of those other conditions as well. I just think it's an unknown, but some theoretical concern.
Okay, thanks. Rosalie, I thank you again, and apologies for going so quickly. And I haven't even let Yola say one word yet. I apologize, it's coming. Think of it now, you're going to have one sentence and you can say the world's most perfect sentence, but I apologize for that. Rosalie, you haven't had a chance to say anything yet either. So I've just done a blitzkrieg approach to thinking of some of the prior auth criteria that, again, payers might consider, depending on how broadly worded the label is. In the process that you will take, could you explain how you think you will think through these clinical trial eligibility criteria? Is the way that I just did it something that you and your group will do? Oops, I'm not sure we can hear you. Oh dear, after all that, and you were waiting so patiently. No, I tell you what, I'll ask my the technical staff. Oh, it says connecting to audio, so maybe we'll have you in a sec. But if not, I will come back. Oh, there we go. Try it now. Oops, and now you're formally muted, so I feel like we're one. Yes.
No.
Yes.
Okay. I apologize. So I'm hearing an echo, so. In regards to your questions, yes, I do think that we would probably follow some of the criteria that you've already laid out. Part of the decision-making process will be, how does the FDA lay out their indication, and also are there any limitations incorporated within their indication? So if there are limitations, we will definitely, or not definitely, but probably include that as part of our prior auth criteria. I think one of our main concerns with this drug is the fact that these high-risk patients were not included in their studies, and we would leave some of that management to the physicians. We always do speak with our clinical advisors in terms of whether they think that we should exclude certain patients from the population. For example, the diabetic retinopathy criteria. That is one that I did not know about. Now, if that's something where our advisors think that that's something we should definitely exclude, then we would incorporate that. I think our major concern will be safety. And because we haven't had long-term, the long-term safety that we have with the ESAs is not there with this drug. I think that's going to be one of our main concerns. And the other concern with this drug will obviously be, is the efficacy similar to the ESAs or not? So that's going to definitely weigh in on how we word the criteria.
All right, thank you. And thank you for wading through the difficulties of being able to connect via the audio. Okay, we're going to spend 10 minutes or less fixing the Medicare bundle Okay, we can do this, right? We can do it. We know we can. But first, Yola is going to get to say something. And as I said, not every meeting am I this mean, but I'm going to say, Yola, I'm shocked because I'm old enough certainly to be part of that evidence-based medicine community that thinks of ESAs as the lesson to remember, where doctors were treating to a number and everybody got kind of in this group think that it was the right thing to do. And lo and behold, we were killing patients, and it's because people weren't looking at the data, kind of holistically, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're hearing people saying, God bless the ESAs, we have long-term safety data, and they're our gold standard against which we need to measure these new guys. So since you are not obviously a maker of roxadustat, but of the ESAs, at least I wanted to offer you a perspective on how you think the coverage should be considered. And then I'm going to move to the bundle because I know there are a couple of points we want to cover there.
I think, and the discussion has really crystallized this. It's very important, I think, that patients do have choices and options, and we've heard that from the patient groups that was in your report, and that they have the opportunity with their physicians to discuss the option, the options that are right for them, and try to obtain payer coverage for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's certainly something that is really important that be preserved through all of this. Of course, as we've talked about, for ESAs, they have been available for 30 years. We have improved our understanding of the benefits and risks of ESAs and how best to use them in our patients. And those have been reflected in labeling decisions and how that guide physician treatment decisions.
All right, thanks. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's talk about the bundle for a second, so we can, in a sense, we can turn to the dialysis dependent group. There are some patients there who are still on private insurance, but for the sake of the argument, let's consider it's Medicare. And I may have to actually ask for an update from someone like Carrie if he knows. But to the best of my knowledge, if it's still not clear that Medicare is going to consider an oral drug as part of the TDAPA. Have they put out an official statement that it is? Because if you go on their website today, it still says injectable or infused drug. So is this, to your knowledge, is this really going to be eligible for TDAPA?
So you're absolutely correct. I can give you my and our best assumptions about this, but I think to say we definitely know the answer. We've had obviously multiple discussions with CMS, and we do believe that based on roxadustat being an innovative drug, even though it is within the functional category of anemia therapies that already exist, that it would qualify for and for those that don't know, the TDAPA is the transitional drug add-on payment adjustment, which we do believe that roxadustat would be eligible for after approval, and would be a 2-year period of transitional drug payment, after which, again, an assumption, we believe that roxadustat would be included in the prospective payment system or bundled payment. Right. Those are our best assumptions.
So I'm not sure of whom to ask this question, but help me understand how we're not creating a bit of a monster here. I'm a dialysis center. I get a bundle for a patient on dialysis that includes kind of a presumed use of ESAs. I get that amount, and I can get paid separately if I don't use an ESA, but I use roxadustat for the patient in my dialysis center. Who's going to argue me out of that in the kitchen where we have our kind of high finance meetings at the dialysis center? I'm worried that the selection of this drug, as Dr. Burns said earlier, it's already predetermined by the powers that be. How does this not create a clear financial incentive for every single dialysis center to switch patients over to roxadustat? Anybody know? I mean, Carrie, I'm putting you on the spot in a way.
Yeah, no, I didn't know. I'm glad to give you my perspective. I mean, sure. I have a long history thinking about TDAPA. I was at Amgen for many years, and the only drug that's gone through this transitional payment was an intravenous calcimimetic, Parsabiv, that we launched at Amgen. I think it's kind of getting back to what's the major intent, and my interpretation is, there's very little innovation in the dialysis space, and we still have a population with huge unmet need. Outcomes are very poor, and I think the overall overarching intent is to provide a mechanism that new and medications that perhaps have some incremental cost compared to other ones, have a chance to be evaluated by dialysis providers to really determine in the real world what is the efficacy and value of these drugs. You've rightly pointed out that no matter how big a phase 3 registrational program is, there's always going to be questions still to be answered in the clinical world. And this provides that period of time, I think, when new therapies and it's have a chance to, to be evaluated.
All right. I will mention, and you know this probably, that MedPAC, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, voted 17-0 in June against this idea that TDAPA would be in the same functional areas where there are already existing treatments. And there's been this fight over whether, as you said, what are the incentives for innovation if you're trying to come into a bundled space? I'll go out on a limb and say certainly, from the way that ICER views the world, where we like to think that incremental payments or prices should be linked to added value, it would make sense to have a TDAPA that's linked to whatever incremental clinical benefit there is over that standing payment that's part of the larger bundle. But to give the whole average sales price on top of a bundle seems like a clear signal to dialysis centers that if you want to make a buck, it's easy as long as you start patients on roxadustat or switch them over, at least for a couple years.
Yeah.
So it makes me feel uncomfortable as a clinician to think that those kinds of incentives would be out there for clinicians who really do get to make this decision without there being any shared decision making for the patients in those centers.
And
Dr. Burns, am I right? Dr. Burns, is that kind of how it would work in your mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there needs to be a great deal of caution in making decisions about therapeutics in the dialysis world if there's an opportunity for profit. We've certainly seen that historically. It's not to say that that's the only basis on which dialysis companies make decisions, but the vast majority of them are for profit. Past behavior has been that what goes on in dialysis facilities at times has been at least partially influenced by profit opportunity. On the other hand, they also want to do what's best for patients. And I think there's that balance of trying to there's just a need to balance those sometimes conflicting inputs.
It is interesting, though, that one of the potential benefits for some patients of having an oral option in the dialysis center context, that kind of doesn't add much value, really, because they have to be given it while they're there. And it's not, maybe it's still a benefit, but it seems less so.
Yeah, actually,
all right.
I don't know the answer to this, but there may actually be some pharmacy issues in dialysis units. It's one thing for them to give an injectable medicine, and this may vary from state to state in terms of what they're allowed to do in terms of dispensing an oral prescription medicine in the dialysis facility, if that's in fact how it's going to be administered.
Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you. All right, with great apologies to you folks, I'm sensitive of the time again. But I do want to end the policy roundtable by giving each of you a chance to make a kind of a concluding statement. We do ask that folks really, really try to keep it to a sentence. Sometimes those sentences have semicolons. We understand that, but we'd like to give you a chance. And this can be something that has already been mentioned that you would like to really emphasize. It would like to be something that you really wished you'd had a chance to say, but you didn't get a chance to say, and now's your chance. And I also encourage people to think of whether you have a request. If you could make a request of one of the other stakeholders to do something different that would make the world a better place for pricing, for access, or for innovation, or we think of all three being the same. If there's a way you want to make a request, we'll capture that too. So I'd like to end with the patient's perspective. And so maybe I could start with our payers and say, again, with apologies that we had to have a slightly compressed policy roundtable today. Thank you for participating. And what would you like to leave us with as your last concluding thought? Leslie, do you mind if I start with you?
Yeah, I'm going to say something because I'm certain that nobody actually said before. The one thing that we didn't talk about when we were talking about any of the patients was that we're not on dialysis, where they had symptoms or not. And so we know a lot of patients actually can be asymptomatic, even with anemia. And that was also a discussion as to treated or not treated, and maybe being a little bit conservative on that end of that, if it's really not interfering with your quality of life, et cetera. I guess the last thing Steve, you also asked then is, I would actually state for every stakeholder sitting at this roundtable, whether it be the pharmaceutical companies, the providers, the patients, is that we really are able to target the right patient. That is going to be the most important. Yes, pricing is going to be in cost and what it's going to mean to insurers and patients and out of pocket. But I would say making sure it's the absolute right patient, who is getting it, the right drug at the right time.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Rosalie?
Yeah, I would like to mirror Leslie's comments there. I think that's really the key here, is that we are making sure that the right patients get this drug. And in terms of accessibility, I think that's going to be important. This is an oral drug, and where I see that it will probably be most beneficial are in those patients that are not able to make it to the dialysis clinics and need that oral option. I'll be interested to see how adherence, how well this is adhered to. For those patients that are taking it once every 2 weeks, this may actually not be the preferred route. And so I think, again, adherence may not be as high with this. And again, lastly, what I would like to say is I'm really excited to see what the FDA has to say about the efficacy of this drug compared to the ESAs and the safety of this drug. That will drive a lot of what we do as payers.
Great, thank you very much. Carrie, I'm coming back to you. A final statement. If you want to tell us how much you're going to price the drug, that's okay. You can do that.
Boy, you're really fishing now. I wish I could. There's a reason I'm on the medical side of things, but I do just want to emphasize, I think, what you've already heard. We believe roxadustat is an innovative therapy, which is a more physiologic way to treat anemia by stimulating a coordinated response that leads to increased endogenous erythropoietin levels, which are much lower than the pharmacologic levels achieved with ESAs. It coordinates better iron metabolism, absorption, and transport, and is able to treat a broad range of populations, including those that have inflammation, at least as judged by high CRP levels. I think just keeping the tone of target populations, we do have a strategy. We're not, initially, I think our target populations are non-dialysis patients, because right now, I think the standard of care is not ESAs mostly. It's mostly doing nothing and allowing patients to get fairly severely anemic. Other populations, the incident
can I ask you to try to wrap it up so I can have time for other folks?
Yep, the last thing. And one population I want to remind people of is the home population. That was mentioned, but remember, based on the executive order, there's a real incentive to increase transplant and home dialysis therapies. And I think an oral therapy makes a ton of sense in those populations as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Yola?
Yeah, so I think, building on the comments we had for the pre-dialysis population, I think also in the dialysis population, it's important that there is a way for physician and patients to continue to have a voice in selecting the therapies that are most appropriate for them. We fully support policies that provide access to innovation, and Carrie talked about those policies for another Amgen product. But it's also important that there are mechanisms where physicians and patients can also choose to stay on existing treatments if those are the ones that best meet their needs.
I.e., don't force people to switch from ESAs to roxadustat, right? You didn't say so in so many words, but that's what would be an implication, right?
That is an implication that the physician should have a role in with the patients in making that decision.
All right, thank you very much. Let me go to the clinical experts, please. Jeffrey, can I start with you?
Yeah, just very briefly, I would just like to say that I'm excited that there is some innovation in this space. Several people have alluded to the fact that we've had ESAs in one form or another pretty much the same for the last 3 decades. So while we're still waiting to see what the place of this new class of drugs is going to be, as a practicing nephrologist, I'm very excited that this day will soon come where we'll be able to begin thinking about implementing these in practice.
Thanks very much. And Penelope.
Yes, I also, I'm very excited with the new advances in our field. And I think it's important to individualize treatment, educate patients, physicians, try to plan, appropriate protocols for, CKD patients, for dialysis patients. Obviously, there are a lot of things to be clarified with the dialysis units. But, from the medical clinical perspective, I definitely want to see more clinical data about, long-term outcomes. We would love to see benefits on MACE outcomes. That will definitely increase our excitement, for the field.
I'm sorry we did not get a chance to talk about future research because, it took many years before, as we all learned ESAs, we learned a lot more about how to use them best. And hopefully the entire clinical research community is going to be figuring out how to make it known about roxadustat in a smaller number of years, assuming it gets approved. All right, let me turn for the patients to be able to share with us their final comments. Troy, do you mind if I start with you?
Certainly. I would just reiterate the importance of patient choice. I think especially given the different methods of administering in this case and having that option for their oral treatment. Certainly, one size does not fit all. So I think the more choice, the better.
Okay, thanks. And Patrick.
I echo what Troy said. Patient choice is a must. And I just want to say thank you just for allowing me to be here and to sit and listen to the work that you're doing. It's really gratifying and appreciative to know that you all are trying to break down these particular strongholds to make sure that you're able to treat people with anemia equally and fairly. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I in turn want to thank all of you because I know it takes effort to spend time. Many of you were here for the entire meeting and it ended up being a relatively circumscribed policy roundtable. But I do think we have some very important themes to carry forward in the final report that we'll make and that a lot of different decision makers will hear of. So thank you. And on behalf of the entire CTAF, I'd like to, again, thank you all. You're more than welcome to stay if you can, because I'd like to now do a very quick turn through the CTAF members themselves to see if they have some concluding statements. We only have about 10 minutes left, so we're gonna have to be even more brief. And if folks on the CTAF don't have a specific statement to make, that's okay. But I'll go through it and then end up with the chair having the last word as we sign out, although I might have a last word too. All right, so I'm just gonna start as we go through and I will start there with Ralph.
Thanks, Steve. I wanna congratulate CTAF staff and advisors on putting together a great report on an important new class of drugs for the medicine chest for the treatment for anemia and CKD. CTAF has a challenge. The reports are to be value to purchasers and payers have to be timely aligned with an assumed FDA approval, but it comes with the downside of the analysis being performed with early or only a modest amount of data, and in this case, even without known pricing of the drug. So my take-home message is the real-world evidence after the release of this drug, hopefully through post-approval studies or registries, will be imperative to inform patients, clinicians, and hospital systems on how to best utilize this new drug for the armamentarium of anemia in chronic kidney disease.
Thanks a lot, Ralph, very much. Richard Seiden.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of things. One is, I think in light of the premature nature of this report, as commented on by Ralph, this report may need to have a more specific disclaimer of reliance until more specific data and published results and pricing is established. So I think we have an obligation to, ICER has an obligation to supplement this one in particular because of the timing of this. I know you try to make these assessments as to which drugs to look at months in advance, so it makes it that much more difficult to make these assessments. I think this one calls out for that. And secondly, I think we need a disease-specific commentator in the early part of the presentation, so we get that perspective up front.
By disease-specific, you mean a clinician or a patient, or
I mean a patient.
Got it. Okay. Thank
Sorry.
you. It's okay. Salee.
I'd first like to start by kind of, where you started, Steve, in terms of I think this is great, showing how basic science innovations that, led to a Nobel Prize actually leads to a therapeutic. So I think first and foremost, having a drug with a different mechanism of action to help these patients who clearly need additional therapeutic options is a wonderful thing. The flip side, of course, is that for a variety of reasons, this area has seen decisions made not necessarily because what's best for patients, but because of the profit motive. And specifically, I'm thinking about the unique situation of for-profit chains who are generally controlling what ESAs were being provided. I think the support of specific quality indicators, which subsequently were, I think, acknowledged to probably be increasing mortality by increasing anemia, hemoglobin targets to greater than what was optimal. All of that was in part funded and supported by kind of this for-profit healthcare ecosystem that we have. And so I think for all of those reasons, it is very important for us to be very wary of perverse incentives that may be set up that may actually lead to higher costs without improved outcomes.
Great, thank you very much. Anthony.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I was sort of puzzled in the last couple of weeks when I was doing my homework for this case as to why ICER was actually considering it at this time, because it seemed there was no FDA approval, there was no pricing, there were very small number of trials. But having sort of had those thoughts, it was very interesting to sit through today's deliberations, and I can see that there is sometimes a benefit and a need to be in early for ICER and not wait for all of these things to happen. And that was my first takeaway from today.
Great, thanks very much. I'm now going to Joy.
Well, I would echo the frustration with the lack of data and the sort of timing of this report, and I understand how difficult it is to find that exact balance. But in this case, I do think we'll need to do a follow-up for it to really have much meaning. And I guess from a clinical perspective and trying to think about it from the patient perspective, even though this is like an incredibly, innovative mechanism, and that's kind of exciting from a clinical perspective, it's minimally, incrementally, maybe possibly better or not. And so to me, that's just really frustrating considering the amount of time, effort, and money that it has gone into this and will continue to go into, I'm sure, trying to get these drugs approved, this drug approved and then marketed, that it doesn't actually offer that much. And I would say at least we've made something of a shift to focusing on outcomes that matter more to patients and a little bit less on the numbers that are so nice to measure but may be misleading as they were with ESAs.
All right, thanks. We have 7 CTAF members left and about 3 minutes. All right, that's your challenge. I know Jeff's got his haiku set up, but Catherine, can we go to you first?
Sure, I agree with what's been said. I wondered why we were doing it so early, but now I understand why we did it early. And it was really helpful to hear what we need more evidence on.
Thank you very much. Jeff.
Okay, thanks. From my perspective, we reviewed evidence with open eyes. We reviewed evidence with 3 eyes. Is it too soon to know? Is it too soon to fund in our eyes?
Always worth the price of admission, Jeff. All right, thank you. Paul.
Yes, in addition to what's been said, I think I was striking lack of knowledge about the standard of care ESAs in their mortality effect, their quality of life benefit. It makes it so hard to then compare it with new therapies.
Very good point too. Thank you, Robert. That's you, Bob.
Me?
Yes, I called you Robert.
You know,
Excuse me.
I don't react to that. You know that. I got to say, I hope bionic kidneys are closer than I expect they are, because my general take here is the state of affairs in chronic kidney disease is abominable, and I think I'm just appalled. Is the best word I can come up with for this whole thing. The science may be Nobel Prize worthy behind this, but this drug is as far from Nobel Prize worthy as you can get. And we should demand more. Everybody in this entire space should demand far, far more than what exists right now.
Okay, thank you. Anne?
Yeah, so I think, roxadustat is promising in the sense that, it does represent a novel mechanism of action. It's available in pill form as opposed to an injection form. Potentially leads to decreased transfusion rates and need for IV iron. But I did find, going through all this data very kind of unsatisfying given the uncertainty of the data, especially as it relates to all-cause mortality and also MACE. And so I think we need to wait more data and also pricing before we really can evaluate the true value of the drug.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think as with everyone else, I'm struck by, the decisions without a lot of data. The only thing I'd add is, as was mentioned, I think that the studies were done, some of them many years ago. So the data is there, it's just not available to us. So I think there's a burden of responsibility of the generators of the data to get that data out there and make it more transparent. And without that, we all have to be left wondering, what does it show? And maybe it shows something that wouldn't be beneficial.
Thank you. And Alex?
Love that quality of life was included in several studies, and would love to see function routinely assessed as an outcome for studies that disproportionately affect older adults.
Thank you. All right, Rena, let me let you have a word, and then I will give one last word on our way out.
Thanks. Well, I really want to say congratulations to ICER. The research, the reports, as always, was so impressive, reached all levels. Wanted to say thank you to our experts and all the commentators. I actually am glad that we did this pre-FDA. It's been something that I wished for in many of our other meetings, pre-pricing. I think that's a good idea, even though it's always an issue in terms of not having all of the numbers that we want. To echo what many people have said, I mean, the basic science is it's fantastic. It's great to see these very novel mechanisms, especially for a population that's had so little in the way of clinical improvement for pre-transplant. But that said, I mean, we just are not seeing here the positive quality, hard clinical outcomes that we want. And I think it's really important that we be careful that we're not rallying around treating a number, which we've done in many other cases in the past, especially for a population that's been this disadvantage that we aren't actually even potentially worsening that by focusing on the wrong outcome. So yes, I hope we have follow-ups to this post-FDA and in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rena. So to all of the CTAF, thank you again for your diligence in thinking this through, looking at the report, asking the right questions, and then you're also kind of thinking about the broader aspects of value that are sometimes hard, again, to crystallize, but important to always keep in mind. I want to thank again the Policy Roundtable members, the patient experts and clinical experts, and the others who really, I think, brought a lot of grounding to our discussion in very important ways. So my last, I guess, takeaway starts where where Elizabeth also found reason to emphasize. These are studies that are 2-3 years old, some of them, and their data have not seen the light of day. And that's frustrating, right? I mean, it means that why shouldn't we be able, and I must admit that there are more and more companies that are getting very comfortable sharing data with ICER under academic and confidence grounds that allow them to share it with us, and it can be redacted in the report, and it can be even near publication or even months away from publication. That process can go quite smoothly. And I do think we need a system that creates incentives for companies to put the data out there and to at least share it so that there can be some form of public discussion. Because if we get on the far end of FDA approval when the prices and the coverage terms are set, there's a huge amount of inertia there that's kind of hard to reel back in. So part of the reason we don't try to get way in front of the FDA decision and the pricing decisions, but the idea that the day that happens, again, the celebration happens, but patients and doctors are going to be making decisions, and insurers too, on the basis of the evidence we have, means that we can serve a purpose by trying to inform those and by setting an incentive, if you will, to get better data out earlier, and so that the companies in some sense don't feel like it's a narrative that they have to carefully own and script and not let anybody else have a peek at. So we're working on that, and I think we talked a fair amount about how we had a different look at the data to a certain extent. The company did share data with us, but I think we all need to see this as an opportunity to do better in the future. Lastly, I'll just say that we don't have a price, and that means that there are some important choices that the company has to make. The other thing that happens the day that the FDA approves a drug is that the company gets to name its price without any negotiation with the federal government, without any kind of national approach to this. And I'm a little bit worried that because this drug is going to be used in two completely different silos of payment mechanisms, odd things can happen where the price could drive use in one arm in dialysis centers, and that might mean that they would price it in a way that would do odd things in the commercial sector. It's a shame that there's so much opacity to that we really can't get through it. And the company, I'm sure, is itself trying to figure out what Medicare is going to do. But ultimately, given the amount of uncertainty about the degree to which this offers a benefit, one of the things that we've often talked about is that shouldn't that mean that the price comes in a little bit lower while we build the evidence to support its clinical effectiveness for certain patients and whether it's better than other options? That there ought to be some way, some mechanism through which our system incorporates that also as an incentive for companies to get better evidence up front and certainly to generate it as quickly as possible after launch. So this is a drug that I hope offers great new opportunities to patients. We don't know enough about it now, and I hope that we can serve all of us as part of a process for getting to a better place where our system will incentivize the companies to produce that data, to make it as transparent as possible, to link it to the pricing, because I think that's where patients ultimately really will win. So my thanks again to all of you for a very rich discussion. The last slide that will go up, we'll talk about next steps, but it includes trying to capture the votes and the discussion and some of the policy perspectives. We will be putting out a final report around the 5th of March. I'm guessing it'll be earlier than that, but we thank all of you for your attendance and certainly for your participation. My thanks to the ICER team, to Reem for a great job as evidence author, to the modeling team, and again to Rena for her first time through as chair of CTAF. So thank you again, and we'll be talking to you soon.